Hi, welcome back to City Limits Stand-Up Desk. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Abigail Savage-Lew, our own reporter on all of our rezoning coverage. And maybe let's talk about East Harlem, because that's sort of where the action is at the moment. Briefly, what's the status of that rezoning proposal?
Yeah, so the East Harlem rezoning proposal just entered ULURP, the 7-month public review process, last week. And so that means that within the next couple months, the community board in East Harlem is going to have to give an advisory vote, and then it will move on to borough president, city planning commission, with an ultimate vote by the speaker, Melissa Mark Viveredo, by the end of this year.
And that would be potentially one of her last acts in office, right? Because she is term limited out.
That's right, yeah.
That rezoning proposal, how does it deal with some of the other land use actions going on in the area? You have the burial ground bus depot at 126th Street, you have the ball fields at 111th. Does that figure into the zoning plan, or at least the assessments that the city's doing?
Yeah, so it's a little complicated. I would say that those different public sites in the neighborhood that are being redeveloped, the 111th Street with 100% rent restricted housing, and the African burial ground with a memorial, as well as housing and commercial space and some other things. Both of those are undergoing their own rezoning, their own public review ULURP process, but they all are sort of happening at the same time, and even some of the documents talk about each other, and so they're all definitely being considered.
So there's an effort to assess the cumulative impact of it all, right? Would you say in some of the environmental documents, or at least an attempt?
Well, in the environmental impact statement for the East Harlem rezoning, it does say and also if the 111th Street Ballfield site is developed with, I think it's 600 plus more units, then that will also impact the area like this.
Right.
These additional.
Some sense of an impact. Yeah. So in East Harlem, as in a couple of the other rezoning neighborhoods, there is a what's called a neighborhood plan generated by stakeholders in the neighborhood that actually emerged before the city's proposal did. Can you explain a little bit about that and how it differs in any way from what the city's put on the table?
Sure, yeah. So a few years ago, the speaker, when she heard that the de Blasio administration was interested in rezoning the area, she basically appointed a steering committee of organizations, and they held public meetings, they held subcommittee meetings with other people, and they created this plan that is called the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan, and it has over 200 recommendations for areas ranging from seniors and open space to a rezoning itself and affordable housing. So that plan was forwarded to city planning, and city planning responded with their plan, which has some similarities but differences, as you mentioned. It proposes higher densities than what the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan had put forward. It also, that there are differences that are being discussed right now. For instance, the East Harlem Neighborhood Planning Steering Committee had really wanted to make sure that as many parcels of public land were developed with 100% rent-restricted housing as possible. And, the city has said, we're making efforts, we're doing this at, the 111th Street site, but they haven't committed to, all those parcels being 100%. And they haven't yet announced whether all the public parcels that the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan was looking at are feasible for redevelopment. So there's differences like that as well.
And of course, both the neighborhood plan and obviously the city's rezoning proposal revolve around the idea that there's going to be a rezoning. Yeah. There are plenty of people in East Harlem who would prefer that not to be the case and say that doesn't need to be the case, right?
Yeah, that's right. So there's El Barrio Unite, there's Movement for Justice in El Barrio, and there are others. And I think that, one question is how much of the neighborhood actually doesn't want a rezoning at all? There's been some frustration with the media. I've even heard frustration that that there's been so much focus on the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan that we aren't, the voice of people who are saying we don't want a rezoning And not just we don't want rezoning, but we have other ideas for how to protect the neighborhood from gentrification.
Because they acknowledge, like the city's argument and developers and some academics, when you say, hold on with the rezonings, is, look, development's happening anyway, we're trying to protect you. So the people who are proposing alternatives both to the city and the neighborhood plan, they're not blind to that threat. They just have a different set of tools. And what are some of those ideas they have?
Yeah, so I just received Movement for Justice in El Barrio's plan, and that is like, it's basically a strategy to try to change the way, overhaul HPD, the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, which they say is failing to protect rent-stabilized housing by not enforcing code violations well enough and not informing tenants about their rights. So that's their position, and I'm going to reach out to HPD on that since I know that they feel like they're doing their job. So
one of the fascinating unknowns for us, and I guess probably for all these groups, is just how many folks in the neighborhood actually know a rezoning is proposed. I mean, whether they are for it, against it, whether they're for some version or the other. And this goes, I guess, to all policy questions, but especially this one that's so locally important. Do you have any sense of what the awareness is in East Harlem writ large about this discussion we're all deeply involved in?
You know, I don't know, and I would love to know how many people are involved, and that's definitely something that people are especially people who oppose the rezoning altogether, are asking, like, how many people actually realize what the decision that's now being invested both in the steering committee, because they are, negotiating a lot with the administration, the steering committee of organizations that Mark Viverito gathered.
Behind the neighborhood plan, this coalition, right?
As well as like the community board, that's, I think another, but I do think that it's worth pointing out that the real estate community is very aware of this plan, and they are both aware of the city's rezoning plan and the East Harlem neighborhood plan, and are saying, one realty report was saying, like, East Harlem is, it's great. It's got the next, rezoning. It's got the Second Avenue subway. It's the next stop for gentrification.
Basically ratifying every fear you hear about what happens when you start talking about a rezoning. The neighborhood plan, the coalition behind it, involves a lot of different groups and players, and I wonder, have they always all been on the same page, or have there been some disagreements within that group as the discussion has gone on, as you mentioned, for a couple of years now? Yeah,
that's a great question, because so I would note that, like, Community Voices Heard, which is one of the leaders of the plan, at the same time has also had their own demands outside of the process, where they've demanded more affordable housing than. More housing for extremely low-income families than even the plan asks for, and I would note that there are a lot of people who participated on subcommittee meetings, who aren't necessarily like voting members of the steering committee. So it's a sort of a large amorphous body.
Interesting. And so this is just one of the rezonings that we're tracking. Several others obviously are thought about, discussed, proposed. The other one that is in the Euler process now is downtown Far Rockaway. Yeah. What's the latest on that? Where does that stand? Yeah, so that rezoning, I would say, all the hearings are much small. Like there are. The borough board hearing I attended last week, there were not that many people there, which, I don't know if that's a sign that it's, like, been less controversial, or maybe that's a simplification of the matter, but basically that ULURP started in, that proposal entered public review a few months ago, and the community board has already voted to approve it, but with many conditions, and addressing, like, the need for a new school, the affordability levels they want, and their desire for lower density. And then last week, there was a hearing by Queensborough President Linda Katz. She had some concerns because at the last minute there were some additions to the plan that actually increased the density. So that will keep moving forward. And it's worth noting for folks who are unfamiliar with the Euler process that the opinions of the community board, with or without conditions, the borough board and borough president with route conditions, those are purely advisory.
Right.
It's only when you get to the planning commission, the city council, and the mayor that people actually have something like final authority, right?
Yeah, although in the Far Rockaway, it's interesting. It does seem like the community board, the borough president, and the council member, Donovan Richards, all seem to be like on the same page as far as I can tell. Maybe not exactly, but they're often like speaking about each other.
And by council custom, the local council member really gets the only vote that matters on a rezoning, which is part of what makes this Harlem so interesting with Mark Favorito there. What about Bay Street in Staten Island?
Yeah, so I mean that Bay Street's rezoning has been out there waiting to be sort of enter public review for a really long time, like basically a year. And so everyone's sort of wondering like, okay, when is it going to happen? But I think the other rezonings, because they're sort of moving forward faster, it's sort of just been waiting. So it will probably be the next one to enter public review.
And we think that Jerome Avenue and Inwood and Long Island City may come later this year, early next.
Jerome Avenue also could be the next one. And then, ones like Inwood, Long Island City are farther behind in the
Right, the Gowanus and Bushwick conversation still going on.
Yeah.
In the area where offices are very close to it, Lower East Side, Chinatown, there's been a very long debate about whether to rezone. And this one's sort of actually prompted by the community asking for a larger rezoning to protect against overdevelopment. Bring us up to date on that, and especially the Two Bridges discussion, which is kind of separate but obviously part of the bigger picture.
Yeah. So this plan that you mentioned, this rezoning plan that many community groups created several years ago, the Chinatown Working Group, it was a rezoning that would have tried to basically increase requirements for affordable housing, set height caps, and in some places allow housing growth, in some places sort of try to preserve what's there. Like that plan never got passed, and but the city is now saying that they may be willing to work with, may be willing to look at a portion of that plan, just covering like sort of Chinatown area, although the borders of that are still not defined. But another part of the Chinatown Working Group's plan, the Lower East Side waterfront, there has been no rezoning there. It allows for basically skyscrapers to be built there. So that area actually is undergoing right now a huge development boom, and there are there's the tower built by Xtel already going up, and now there are 4 other towers proposed for the waterfront, and so there's an environmental review process that sort of considers all those towers happening right now, and there's going to be a big meeting on that end of this month.
So you've been tracking all these rezonings for more than a year, all told. And I wonder, we recently talked about the first anniversary of the East New York rezoning. As you've watched the process unfold in different neighborhoods, do you see community groups in neighborhood B learning from what folks did in community A? Do you see the city evolving in terms of how it approaches these discussions in different areas? Are we seeing a different approach to rezoning than we would have 2 years ago under Mayor de Blasio?
Well, to your first question about are the neighborhoods watching each other, I think that's for sure. I think a lot of neighborhoods often say like, we don't want to be like East New York. Although, it's true that all these neighborhoods have very different sort of housing conditions, but there's like a push by some neighborhood groups that that we want to demand more, or we want to get out of it more. I would say that the city, I think the city definitely has been listening and hearing some of the language that's used. The desire for deeper affordability, the desire for nonprofits to be developing housing and not just for profits. But I think the question, that can be debated is like whether their answers go far enough to actually meet. They increase the funding for extremely low income units, but some advocates would say by not nearly enough, or there's various things like that. Yeah.
Abby, thank you. Tell your editor he's doing a great job.
I will.